Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first Couch Blab podcast. My name is Ben, and these are my two co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Hope Bloom. I'm one of the people here, and this is...
Hello, my name is Tiffany Segeron. This is my first time doing this. Welcome to Couch Blab podcast. I'm really excited to be here. I'm going to be one of your co-hosts, and today we're going to be talking about Night of the Living Dead from George Romero. We figured this would be a good opportunity to talk about it since basically he had passed really recently, so we figured now would be a good time to talk a little bit about his film, the development of it, and be able to contribute and talk about the development of the film and all the different stuff that he'd been working on.
Yeah, basically, why not start with pretty much his first movie he ever did, which was the 1968 Night of the Living Dead. So, to begin off, this movie is pretty much one of the defining movies that basically describe what the general modern-day example of a zombie is. However, I will say right now, this movie didn't feel exactly like all of the archetypes were in there at the beginning. I feel like some of his later movies actually put more emphasis on some of those archetypes, but some are seen in here, and generally this is the first one that people recognize when they say modern day zombie. But let's get into it.
Yeah, like he did say in a couple interviews that he took inspiration from like I Am Legend, for instance, for like the cannibalistic nature of the zombies, but the whole thing where like the radiation causes the like any dead bodies to come back to life, and then further on with like the bite turning the little kid at the end, like that was established and expanded upon in this movie, like really getting the genre started.
Yeah, well, we'll get into that later down, but let's start from the beginning of this movie. So basically, this whole movie sets up at the beginning that these two brother and sister are driving along basically to go put a grave on their father's like grave.
The wreath. It's a wreath.
Oh yeah, excuse me, a wreath. Yeah, basically, this is another thing that's really interesting where they don't really give you a setup as to why this zombie outbreak happened, at least until like you don't even know that it's going on really. At the beginning of this movie, we're basically the only information we're given about something being even the slightly bit off is like the fact that they have a radio interference at the beginning, and that's about it. But he turns the radio off shortly before anything even happens. So basically, we start with those two characters, Barbara and her brother, which I believe is named Johnny? Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's Johnny.
Yeah.
Johnny has the keys, remember?
Yeah. Oh, okay. So basically, they go to the thing, and then we get one of the most iconic lines from the entire genre, which is, "They're coming to get you, Barbara," and stuff like that.
Look, there's one over there now.
Yeah. Because he's basically just picking on Barbara because she's like, she talks about how she like, he used to scare her when she visit that place or something like that, which actually probably builds up to why she basically becomes like completely useless through the rest of the movie when she goes into complete shock. Kinda.
If he hadn't freaked her out, she probably would have been alright. Although she probably would have been freaked out in the first place, considering what happens.
I mean, like, you know, the death of a loved one is enough to shock anyone into a state of catatonia, but, like, Jesus
Oh, yeah.
Christ,
Well,
was she
to
fucking
be
annoying
fair,
in this
though,
film.
it's quite interesting. At the beginning of this movie, when she's being chased by the initial zombie that we first encounter, she actually does do a lot of smart things at the beginning when trying to get away from this thing. Like, she actually, like, pulls the brake to the car when she realizes there's no keys just to let it roll. Like, she gets a, like, she knows as soon as she runs into the house that we had that the most of the movie takes place in, she gets a knife, she locks the doors. Like, she's somewhat capable, like, through this of trying to avoid this thing. But once basically we get introduced to a later character, which is basically the real main character of the movie that we'll talk a little later about. Basically, the actual main character that we get, she's basically useless to the rest of the movie after that.
Yeah, like a doll, and then like Judy, who comes after her, is like no better, and like when like they bring her up from the cellar and everything, later, and they're sitting next to each other, and I'm like, wow, did they clone her or something? What is this?
Yeah.
Well, actually, interestingly enough, like George Romero actually had Barbara's character like originally written like to be more strong-willed and independent and more of an actual player through the movie, but the actress who played her, actually her performance as like the shocked girl like seemed more interesting to him at the time, so he changed the script.
Oh.
Well, like, the concept of the shock girl is a big thing that resonates within a lot of 60s movies or a lot of 70s movies. It makes the main protagonist, in this case being Ben, seem all the more heroic and kind of, you know, something that can lead more within the story. So that isn't something that's new by any means. And like a lot of movies written during the time period, this was just something that was considered, you know, standard. As we look at it nowadays, it seems a bit dated, but this is kind of just standard mentality for the time period until, you know, things that happen later on, you know, we have different movements and things to try to make women a lot more stronger in the, you know, motion picture. But essentially during the time period, this was just like, oh, okay, cool, so this is essentially what we're going to be doing.
I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have its, like, place, you know, like, it was intriguing for, like, the first couple of times, but then after a while, where they were just like, you know, her brother was killed, that's why she's like this, it's like, it's kind of started to lose its novelty. I'm like, oh man, can't you at least do something before you die? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah.
In that case, I mean, good thing about this film, though, is where it kind of lacks a little bit with Barbara, in my opinion. It really makes up in a lot of different areas with Ben, because Ben's character himself is extremely smart and very, very capable on his own, and it was actually, it was well known during the time period for being a movie that can kind of show a forward-thinking character, and essentially a character that wasn't the first to get killed off, especially due to the fact that he was African-American.
Oh, hell yeah.
But interestingly enough, that was also a script change, because originally the character of Ben was supposed to be this truck driver who the race wasn't determined by the character.
Oh no, he was originally set to be white, you know?
Yeah, well, actually it was like either or, right? But the character itself was also supposed to be like this kind of mean-spirited. He was also kind of be like a bit like dirty, like dirty mouthed and like stuff like that. But when the actor Duane Jones actually came aboard to be the character, and he like spoke in such like better, smarter tone, like again, George Romero basically rewrote the character to fit it better because he liked Duane Jones' iconic performance out of this.
Yeah, and I think it definitely serves the purpose of the film a little bit better. I think it's a lot more entertaining for audiences, and basically it helps move the story along to have a character that's more competent, especially for the kind of situation that you're sitting in. Because even in modern day, you know, when you're talking to people, essentially like, oh, well, it's easily, like, you can just board up the windows, or like, why don't you just move and grab the gun? You know, seeing a character that's competent is a lot more refreshing, especially in these type of genre, where, you know, you're always kind of taking a back seat and trying to help the characters do what they need to, and kind of just, you know, complaining about, oh, why don't they just do this or do that? It's a lot more endearing to follow a character that is, you know, taking all that into consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Duane Jones really did a good job, because like he's not only the anchor for, like, you know, like the shell-shocked Barbara, like how he's calm and he presents himself, he has control of the situation, but he's also like an anchor for the audience. Like while I was watching the film, I was just like, oh man, Ben really has his shit together. Like, he's really in charge.
Yeah, he's constantly on the move in this movie. Like, there's not a moment where he is just, like, sitting down. Even when he's just sitting or standing somewhere, he's, like, in a pose constantly of, like, I'm about to do something just to get something done.
Well, he's ready. In that kind of situation, you have to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, in this movie, Ben is one of the characters that just, like, works really well, and, like, you know, he has to. He's the main character, you know, making up for all the rest of the characters who are, like, basically no more than, like, tropes or names.
We'll get more into those characters, but before we do that, let me go back to, well, the actual part of the movie that a lot of people focus on, the zombies. So we talked about the first zombie that was in this movie, which was, like, I think like a groundskeeper type guy. He was this big tall guy. I forget the actor's name, but actually, he basically made the movements that he did at the beginning kind of resemble like Boris Karloff, like Frankenstein, or other sort of like movies that had him in there. So that's why he walked that way in the movie and did kind of the weird shamble. But again, I need to focus on something, because George Romero, like, he's the father of zombies, and he's throughout time like talked about the many things that he thinks a good zombie was, and ironically enough, some of the traits that he doesn't like about a lot of modern day zombies, this zombie in particular was doing throughout the movie. Like, he didn't say he liked fast zombies or running zombies, right? Guess what? This guy is running through most of his scenes at Barbara.
Yeah, isn't it true that at one point, like, the zombie itself, when they are, like, gunning inside the house, actually tries to break the window open? Is that right?
Yeah, he actually uses a stone. Like, he actually has the thought process to pick up a stone to break through a car window, and later in the movie another zombie actually picks up another rock to throw through a window to shatter it. Like, they actually have enough conscience to think about that, which is really interesting because, again, that's not like a usual trait of a zombie. Now, George Romero has made other movies where there are smart zombies, obviously with Bub from Day of the Dead, and Land of the Dead speaks for itself with a whole army of ones that were smart enough to do stuff. But I think the first time you see it kind of is in this, and it's really interesting just like how, like, it's just so different from what you think a George Romero zombie does.
Well, I mean, like, the actors that pick up the stones, maybe not so much the first guy, Bill Hensman, because he was, like, really freaking gunning it to kill Barbara there, but later in the movie, when they pick up the stone, they pick it up, like, slowly, as though, like, you, like, leave it up to interpretation whether, like, there's actually some sort of, like, lower functioning consciousness there, or it's, like, basically just instinct, where it's, like, heavy thing can break, like, glass.
Yeah.
Like, they leave it up to interpretation, like, what's really, like, a little bit of mystery for the zombies there.
Yeah. But, what's also interesting, this thing fights Johnny at the beginning and basically wins the fight by slamming his head into the gravestone. But again, that's another thing you don't really see with a lot of zombies. Like, a lot of zombies will just kind of jump forward and just grab onto you. This guy has a straight-up brawl with Johnny. Like, they are basically arm to arm at each other, just like pushing forward, back and forward, kind of having like a legitimate fight, to where if you were just watching this with no context at all, you probably wouldn't even have thought this guy was a zombie at point. You probably could have just thought he was like some like mutant madman or something.
Yeah, I mean, since it's the first one to kind of set up the premise for what a zombie actually is, a lot of it was still kind of in the development stage as to what the perception of it is. At this point, like you brought up earlier, where, you know, the person who was playing him got its inspiration from, like, Frankenstein for the movements and the different actions. It was kind of on the baseline of it's still able to respond and react to certain things, but it uses kind of someone that's essentially kind of slow-witted but could still have, you know, enough viability to be a major point of attack towards people.
Yeah, and I think it's good even for, like, the Frankenstein acting in the beginning, because, like, man, they didn't give this guy any, like, visual cues as to, like, that he's a zombie. He's just dressed in a regular suit. Like, maybe it's slightly ruffled, but, like, later on in the movie, we get to see, like, zombies with, like, gore on their faces. Their faces are blown up. They've got bullet holes in them. But, like,
yeah,
for this guy, he just looks like, you know, like, he didn't even look like he was attacked or anything, or that he was buried. He doesn't have any dirt on him. I'm like...
He was kind of just out in his Sunday best, essentially.
Yeah, I'm, like, wondering, how the hell did this guy die? Did he, like, get the cold or something?
Yeah, well, again, there's a lot of interesting things about that, because, again, it's starting of the whole big zombie apocalypse, and this is just the bare bone beginning of it. And so it's, again, interesting that they take these two characters from the beginning, basically put them out far away on a drive where they wouldn't even hear mostly about any of this going on, and it just makes you wonder what all was going on while they were driving, to where when they get there, it's already happened to a bunch of people around the town and stuff.
So yeah, I definitely agree with you in that sense. And as kind of the movie progresses, you get to see the different elements that still show up in zombie movies today. There's a lot of sequences in which the houses are boarded up and they're trying to, you know, get supplies in the house to protect themselves, and those zombies keep trying to tear down windows, and he's just trying to keep them at bay while they're trying to stay alive. Those things still carry over into films nowadays too.
There is a scene though, like where he's talking, like Ben's talking to Barbara, and he's just like, this place is boarded up very well now, and in the background you can see a window like just fucking wide open. Like, there's a lot of...
He did it. He tried to do his best.
I know, but
on.
like there's a ton of inconsistencies in this movie. I feel like have gone, like, either aren't noticed or just not addressed. Like, when Barbara loses her shoes and is running barefoot before, like, they get to the scene where she loses her shoes. Or, like, even later on, what was it? Oh, when Ben goes upstairs and he finds the dead bodies and he drags them away and throws them out the window. Like, we don't know how long those bodies were there. But, like, you know, they get to the point, like, the newscast, the freaking brilliant newscast exposition, where, like, it tells us, oh, hey, yeah, it only takes a couple of minutes for these bodies to reanimate, so it's like, I really wish they had established the rules a little bit more firmly in this movie, because, like, especially with that one zombie in the beginning and then the rest of the zombies, like, even though this is the defining part of the genre, it's kind of all over the place.
Well, again, this was an indie film, so basically George Romero was doing this on a cheap budget, and even then, the idea of what he wanted the zombies to do was sort of going along as the movie was being made. Like, for, again, another thing to bring it back to Frankenstein, these zombies, they react to fire. Like, they just see fire and they're like, they try to avoid it because they're, like, afraid of it almost, which is another, like, more of a Frankenstein thing than a zombie thing.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays you wouldn't see zombies kind of reacting to fire because they act kind of on a mindless scale.
Yeah.
But, you know, back in these days where they were kind of just making it up on the fly, you know, whenever they could basically start filming and they received the funding in order to do so, you know, they would just figure out, you know, what's the thing that would be the most interesting for the story.
Yeah. Well, I will say there are reasons to that, but I'll get to those later towards the end of the podcast. But let's go next into basically, let's meet the rest of the people who are in this house. Now, a good bit, like Ben and Barbara, well, mostly Ben, is basically boarding up the house, basically putting fire outside to distract the zombies away for a good bit. And they find a radio and they're listening to, like, news reports of how this stuff is going down. Again, it's basically explaining not even everyone is still sure what's exactly going on in this world. We find out that there's a secret cellar door bound to a basement, and who comes out of it first are nothing but Tom, I think that's right, yeah, and Mr. Cooper, probably the most other prominent character of this movie for other reasons.
Yeah.
We find out that Mr. Cooper and his wife and child are both basically in the basement, and also Tom's girlfriend, Judy? Sorry, she's also forgettable in this movie, so it's kind of hard to basically talk that much about her. Basically, she gets like one dialogue between Tom at one point, and that's about it. Cooper is Harry. He's basically just this angry, tied-up guy. And this is another interesting thing that they show in this movie. There's a part basically where he's obviously arguing with Ben. Like the first time they meet, they're already at tension with each other, because he says the only thing good to do is to stay in the cellar, and Ben says, at least we have a fighting chance up here on, like, the top floor of the house. So basically they're already arguing the moment they see each other. So basically when Mr. Cooper goes back into the basement, he has an argument with his wife, and this is actually something interesting that I feel doesn't actually get brought up a lot. Like, you can already tell that this couple doesn't really like each other, because they already seem like they were fighting even before this whole zombie thing happened.
I mean, they flat out say they don't like each other at some point, I think, in the script. Like, they were fighting for a bit, and she's just like, well, like, we don't have to like each other, but I'd rather not end up dead, or something to that effect. Like, they literally spell it out that this couple is having problems. Yeah,
especially since their daughter was, spoiler alert, got bit, but we find that out later anyways. Spoilers for however year-old movie. This came out in 1968, so yeah.
Yeah, it's like you had like 50-something years to see this movie, like,
Yeah.
Yeah, and them being put into the situation really doesn't help that much.
I mean, like, she is how we learn that, like, the bites are, that they actually turn people. Like, none of the news casters in the scenes, in any of the scenes, remark on that fact. It is her turning at the end, that, like, final twist that clues us into, like, it's not just the dead, but also, like, the living that will also turn. It's pretty standard now that, like, zombie bites are infectious, but back then, I'm sure, like, threw many people for a loop.
In that case where, she gets bit, it kind of establishes, when you get bit, you get turned into one of these things. Writers would turn it into things like, like the infection or just anything in general. It never establishes as kind of an infection, but it at least establishes it as kind of the basis for how this gets started and how things progress into turning into one of these zombies.
Yeah, speaking of the radio cast and the television cast, which, by the way, they find a TV a good 45 minutes into this movie, and basically they watch, like, basically the whole world trying to basically describe what's going on. Like, they're telling the usual stuff, find medical shelter, and they have, like, these little checkpoint areas, and then trying to explain why these things are coming back, which this is another interesting thing that we don't ever hear from really any of the other of the Dead movies that George Romero made, but they bring up the idea that could have been more of a outer space type thing, because they bring up this satellite probe that was supposed to go to Venus, but because of the heavy doses of radiation that it got from being on Venus, they had to destroy it, and then they bring up the fact that the radiation might actually be the reason this is happening, which is a really interesting sci-fi element that I don't think it's ever really brought up again in any of the Dead movies.
Well, it's never brought up again because, I mean, obviously it's the 60s, it doesn't make any fucking sense, but, one small satellite, they blow it up in the atmosphere, and suddenly the radiation that presumably scatters everywhere causes the bodies to activate, come up out of the ground, and bite people. Like, it's not mentioned again because, like, it doesn't make any scientific sense. One satellite wouldn't do that. That's not how radiation works.
Well, zombies don't really make any scientific sense either.
No, it doesn't. None of them would be able to move, but, like, it is kind of interesting, but I didn't want to roll my eyes too hard at that.
I think it's actually just a kind of interesting, different take on, the subject of how do zombies get started, even though you don't see it nowadays because it might be a little bit too much on the left field. I think that basically having it as an element of, this is basically the 60s, the space race is a massive thing, what are the different possibilities in which, that can affect us. The, satellite that's returning from Venus explodes into the Earth's atmosphere, and it basically kind of causes the whole situation with the zombie apocalypse. We have constantly that we hear about radiation, even nowadays, into the zombie apocalypse, so we never hear it in such a fashion that, takes it from a different left field. Nowadays it's like, a contamination from a source or disease or famine.
Yeah, disease.
But even nowadays it's kind of now just like, this is the only way in which we can do this. There's no other way that we can disclose how zombies could even happen in the first place. Having a certain way such as radiation from outer space or something could definitely take it in a much different turn than just simply saying the same thing over and over.
To be fair, though, we're not exactly talking about zombies, or at least according to this movie, because nowhere in the movie do they actually refer to these things as zombies. In fact, they're only ever called these things or ghouls at one point by a newscaster. So, which is another interesting thing, which, I mean, again, if they had not called this movie Night of the Living Dead, and had only been referred to them as the things or ghouls, I wonder, honestly, would we even consider these things zombies at what all previous movies before up until then had described what zombies were, which were more like mind-controlled slaves, almost?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, the concept of calling it zombie didn't come up until much later. But, I mean, I still think that because of the fact that we refer to them as zombies nowadays, that just kind of sets up a predisposition for it.
Yeah.
I still think there's plenty to take away from it, though. Like, even whether or not it's, officially a zombie or, not disclosed as a zombie, its main merits include that because it's kind of the first one that sets up what it should do and what it shouldn't do, there's a lot of creativity that goes on to how do the zombies start, how do they attack, the way that they think, that I feel like a lot of filmmakers today can still take away a lot from.
What we see throughout most of the movie is, again, it's mostly arguing between Ben and Mr. Cooper while the others kind of sit around and have to go about it. But essentially what the plan is, right, that there's a truck that Ben actually got to, and the reason he drove to this house in the first place, that there was a gas pump near the barn next to the house, and his truck was out of gas, but it has a lock on it. So the whole plan was, we need to get that lock, find the key to that lock, and to get that pump going so they can fill the truck and get out of here. And they eventually do settle on that plan, and it goes horribly wrong.
Oh man, yeah, like everyone in horror movies has to hold like the idiot ball like every once in a while to get like the horror actually going. But when Tom took a hold of that gas pump and he's just like, whoops, and he spills it all over the tires, I'm like, are you kidding me? Are you really? And then when the whole thing sets on fire, I'm just like, well, it seems they've died.
Well, to be fair, Ben also just laid the torch that he was holding to defend the zombies off in the first place. He kind of just laid it there on the ground near the car in the first place, which was probably a bad idea.
Yeah, at first I thought it was just like, oh, he's laying it in the dirt, right? So it won't, like, nothing will catch on fire. But then I saw, like, there's grass around there, like, not even, like, lively grass, just, like, real dead stuff. And I'm like, why did the whole set just go up at that point? Like,
well, that's a good point, I think just kind of for condensing the story's sake, and also because of the realization that, there's only so much money to do this, they probably just set that one thing on fire, and then as soon as they were done shooting, just put it out.
Yeah. This is basically, after this situation, the pump, obviously, it leaks gas because Tom dripped it off, and the fire catches onto the gas, and while Ben's trying to stomp out the fire from getting to the pump so it doesn't explode, Tom and Judy who both drive the truck away, and the corner of the truck sets on fire, which then blows up the truck and catches it ablaze, killing Tom and Judy in the process.
Barbecue.
And yeah, basically, I mean, you're not wrong. We do see the equivalent of a barbecue going on after this scene, but first,
I mean, even though all the flesh that the zombies eat afterwards looks pretty raw.
Yeah. Essentially, what happened is, once that basically goes, and then Ben's plan is to just run back to the house, which he told Mr. Cooper to let him in. Obviously, Mr. Cooper being stubborn, and also the fact that he's lost hope because the truck blew up, doesn't open the door for him, and then Ben has to bust his way in like he does because Ben is a badass, and through this entire movie, basically he gets fed up with Cooper the last straw, literally punches the crap out of him with the most fakest punches in the whole movie.
Oh yeah, it's like really staged.
I wouldn't say that though. Like, the whole movie is like pretty, like, apart from like the zombies shuffling, any interaction between characters is kind of like poorly physically acted. Like, it's just like they're not really hitting each other.
Yeah, but you see, there is a moment where I can complain about this because we actually saw a punch earlier in the film, which, let's talk about that for a second. Basically, Barbara goes into an immense shock and tells, we need to go back and get Johnny, even though Johnny at this point must be clearly dead. And she basically goes into such a panic that she starts shaking at Ben and eventually slaps him, and then Ben clocks her straight in the face to the point where she gets knocked out through a good 10 minutes of the movie. Which is actually a scene, again, Dwayne Jones, the actor who played Ben, actually asked Romero that he wanted to cut that scene because he felt, because of the high racial tensions at the time this movie was made, he wouldn't feel comfortable with the idea of people watching a black man punching a white woman in the face, and it would seem bad. Now, George Romero
it certainly doesn't translate nowadays.
Well, yeah, because George Romero at the time said, it seems hip that we're keeping this in. It's to show him the man, right? And then later down the road, you see interviews where he was like, yeah, I probably should have edited that part out.
Yeah, it doesn't translate nowadays, and kind of nowadays when I watched it, it's just kind of on a sarcastic level of like, oh yes, this seems like a viable idea. I can understand kind of on the perspective of, they're trying to create tension in the story. It's not aging anytime soon.
I mean, I didn't think it was necessarily bad. I was just like, well, geez, it's really showing that things are pretty dire, that in the time he is willing to hit her to kind of snap her out of her hysteria. I think I appreciated that scene a little bit. more, you know?
Yeah, I mean, she kind of needs to get her shit together.
It's an interesting debate on its own, but basically, let's get back to the actual plot of the movie, since that was way earlier on and now we're farther along the map. Essentially, what it gets down to is, since Tom and Judy are dead, it's basically the Coopers, Ben, and Barbara left, which, again, Barbara at this point is just a background object almost. So basically their other plan is, I mean, Ben's basically just trying to think of anything. They asked the Coopers, do you think we could get back to their car that they came back from? And this is the part where Barbara actually becomes useful for one last time and actually mentions the car that she rode into and the fact that Johnny had the keys on him. Now the question is, do we try to go after that, or do we ford up into the house still? And this argument goes on for so long that it draws even more peril down the line, because this is the part where the zombies actually do start breaking into the house.
Oh yeah, they start like kind of breaking through the windows and everything.
Yeah, we get that iconic hands through the boards moment. Like, up to this point, like, characters like I can understand Barbara being grabbed right away and her being useless, but like up to this point, Helen had been she had been like a pretty nice character to watch for a little while, you know, like arguing with her husband, smoking a little bit, but like in this ending scene, she gets kind of grabbed and like ended right there, and I'm just like, oh, that's a bit of a waste. I kind of wish she had done something else.
Yeah, like I actually did like her character quite a bit, to kind of just see her go out.
She was the best female of the movie.
Oh my goodness, yeah, but well, like by a long shot. I mean, like the bar is pretty low here, but like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Like she actually tries to console Barbara a little bit.
Like, tries to help her out. She's like trying to treat Ben with a certain level of respect. And then just to kind of see her go out, you know, I feel like it's something that's a bit of a wasted opportunity. But at least I enjoyed her in the time that she was actually on screen, and I think that's worth something.
Yeah. Okay, so what essentially, before we get into like the whole break-in of the house, I forgot to mention the whole part where we actually see mostly the zombies in their best part probably throughout the movie, which is them slowly eating what was left of Tom and Judy out of the truck and ripping basically what looked to be the best that they could do with making it look like guts and organs and intestines and stuff. Most of that stuff was actually roast ham and chocolate syrup.
Really? I would have thought it was like chicken liver or something, because like they did a pretty good job.
It was mostly roast ham, and all the blood throughout the movie, every single bit, was chocolate syrup.
I mean, like I watched the colored version and the black and white version to kind of compare the two. Like, you know, the color version is like, it's really well done, but like I guess for the black and white, they don't really have to worry about whether the red is visible, the gore is good enough. They just have to worry about the sheen. So, oh wow, yeah, now that you say that, chocolate syrup does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, they needed to get the consistency somehow, I'd imagine.
I mean, like, that certainly works, even if...
But, yeah, I mean, it was the effects at the time. Originally, let's talk about the zombies real quick. I'm going to say right now, the makeup on the zombies isn't exactly the best out of the movies, but again, being the first one, I can give it a pass on that. But I will say, interesting enough, it doesn't really look like there's flesh coming off of these zombies. It looks more like they have chipped paint on them. Like, they look like a wall that has paint chipped from it, almost, at points.
Yeah, like, kind of flaky.
They probably took the plaster from the paint and just started to kind of peel it back a little bit when the makeup artist went in and were like, oh, the paint's peeling off? Okay, well then let's just take, like, kind of the skin graft that we usually use to construct, you know, out of plaster for the paint and, you know, for basically the makeup effects, and just kind of start peeling it off so that it gives the illusion of that. You know, over the years, they would explore with it more, try to figure out a more convincing way to do it. But I think for their first time, that's probably what they had to offer.
Well, to be fair, if anything, if you don't like the effects, you can also blame Mr. Cooper for that, because he was the actor who played Mr. Cooper was also one of the makeup artists.
God damn it, Cooper ruins everything.
I'm sure he tried his best.
Yeah, he's pretty evil. Yeah, he actually did a lot for this movie. He actually took the pictures that were used at the end credit sequence, and Yeah, he did one other thing. I'm trying to remember, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But he did a lot, but that was kind of a lot of the roles in this movie. A lot of zombies were other people who were just generally working on the film on other things and stuff.
I mean, yeah, it was all hands on deck. Like, you know, all, like his friends like were recruited to be like zombies, like a bunch of like just extras who like were called out to be like, hey, you want to like walk around, shamble around in makeup?
Again, like even the corpse from the beginning of the movie, I'm talking about the one that was upstairs, that was, you know, the first sign of a dead, really dead corpse-looking thing, the skeleton, and with the eyes and everything. Interestingly enough, George Romero made that himself, and he actually used ping pong balls for the eyes.
I believe that. That sounds...
Yeah, I can believe that, definitely.
Again, they were trying to just basically use anything they had on hand, so... but it's actually quite interesting because originally Tom Savini was originally going to do the effects for this, and now for people who don't know, Tom Savini is a famous horror movie like makeup designer. He's basically done like the gore effects and like the makeup effects for like so many iconic horror movies, but he couldn't get to do this because at the time he was drafted to be a Vietnam photographer, which is actually probably turned out to be the best for him because he mentions in other documentaries that him being a photographer in Vietnam was actually how he discovered more techniques of how to make gore look more realistic, because he actually took photos of dead bodies and like bludgeoned bodies, obviously through war-torn almost. So, which he actually said was a big inspiration on how he created the effects for a little favorite movie of mine, Friday the 13th. But anyways, it would have been interesting to see what this movie would have looked like had Tom Savini actually done the effects for it. I'm actually wondering if they would have looked better or like probably at the same degree for the effects that were available at the time.
I mean, Savini, like for what it's worth, he did come back to direct the 1990 remake.
Okay, so getting back to the movie, so this is the part where all hell breaks loose, essentially, where characters are getting pulled out one by one, essentially, when Johnny comes back as a zombie and then pulls Barbara out. And we find...
that's like the end of Barbara's arc right there, like where she sees Johnny for like the last time, like as a zombie, and then she gets consumed.
Well, at least she finally got to go get Johnny.
Oh man, yeah, you know, reunited at last in some kind of morbid way.
Reunited, and it feels so good.
Yeah,
basically. And then also Mrs. Cooper gets pulled by her hair, at least, but during the middle of all of this, basically, Mr. Cooper is too busy paying attention to the gun that Ben has, because he really wants that gun, because he doesn't feel confident,
nice.
I guess, until he gets that gun. So instead of helping them board up the thing to get the zombies from gusting in, he actually tries to grab for the gun. Ben knocks him away, and then he's fed up with Mr. Cooper, and then proceeds to unload lead straight into him.
I mean, it's all in a bit of the moment. Like, it's weird to say if he deserved it or not, but like, you know, that's what leads him down to the cellar to make the big reveal that Karen's a zombie now.
Yes, his little daughter is a zombie. Well, actually, when he walks down the stairs, she's still laying down there. Now her eyes are open.
Oh right, yeah, it's she's dead by that point, but you're right. It's Miss Cooper who actually goes down to discover that she's reanimated. Yeah,
Mrs. Cooper. So basically what happens is he starts fumbling down the stairs and he dies there on the spot on the ground, and with his daughter just laying there. And then Mrs. Cooper runs back into the basement as well, and there he finds that her daughter has become a zombie and is eating the remains of Mr. Cooper. Again, originally this scene was actually supposed to be different. Apparently, Mr. Cooper was supposed to have died, then turned into a zombie, and when Mrs. Cooper came down, he was eating the bits of his daughter. But they thought that was going to be too graphic for an audience and too traumatizing for an audience of a man eating a little girl on screen, so they changed it.
It would have been awesome.
Oh, it would have been rad, but...
I mean, it would have been awesome either way. I think it's like It's interesting that a tiny edit such as that, like, started the whole thing that, like, oh man, she became a zombie because she died and reanimated, but it also, like, oh man, once bitten.
You just get what essentially is the whole idea of once you're bit and you become a zombie. But if it's interesting that if they had kept that original idea, that whole idea of being bit probably wouldn't have been standard for zombie lore, which is quite interesting.
It probably would have been something like within proximity.
Yeah. So again, Mrs. Cooper goes down, and then she doesn't know how to take this, but basically she goes like, "Baby, my poor baby," and then her daughter decides to get a shovel trowel or something. What is that thing, like a gardening shovel?
Yeah, you're right. It's a trowel.
Yeah. Okay, and basically proceeds to stab her, like on screen.
I mean, like, it could also be considered a spade, given how sharp it is. Like, it just punctures her so easily.
Anyways, the gardening implement that she uses to stab her mother is probably actually the most goriest thing in the whole movie. Because they show it going into her multiple times. Like, this isn't like Psycho, where we decide to just rub the knife up against in clear shot.
Yeah, like, that trowel scene is definitely the best source of, like interpersonal physical acting in the film, where it's like, two characters working together to create something that's believable. And I'm like, oh, finally, someone actually looks like they're being murdered, if it's not for, like, the extensive cuts here.
Yeah, so basically all that's left of the whole gang is Ben at this point. And basically he does, which is kind of ironic in a sense, because the whole movie he's going like, our best chance is to stay up here. At least we have a fighting chance, right? But then, ironically, he goes down to the cellar and locks himself in, basically doing the exact opposite of what he didn't want to do from the very beginning. I
mean, to his credit, three of them died in the cellar, so he wasn't wrong.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixed answer to that one. Neither is really a good solution.
I just feel like if he was going to take his chance, he would have ran out another door or something,
I mean, he stumbles amongst the zombies pretty efficiently earlier, like the way he makes it all the way back to the house. I was just like, well, geez, you could just keep an eye on them and keep going if you needed to, just to make it wherever you wanted to go.
Well, actually, ironically, the 90s remake actually makes a joke about that, but that's at another time of discussion. Anyways, so he locks himself into the thing. He goes downstairs. He sees that the little daughter Karen zombie is eating away, and he has to shoot her off screen, of course, because Lord knows we can't shoot a child zombie.
While we're bringing up the concept of shooting the zombies, there's actually an earlier scene in which they bring up that in order to kind of stop the zombies, you have to be able to shoot them in the head, or deliver some kind of blow to it. There's also, you have to be able to set them on fire to take them out. And that's kind of the first thing that, establishes in zombies. That's like, if you want to get rid of a zombie, you gotta, aim for the head, essentially.
And fire. Fire is also a good way to, make that work, too.
Yeah, just shoot him in the head, like the guy on the television said.
Well, he wants to make it clear, that there's no way that could be misinterpreted.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they kind of air it during the part where, they're basically showing off, Tom and Judy kind of getting murdered is when that whole scene basically happened.
Well, actually, they show it even before when they were trying to go through the window and grabbing onto Tom and Ben, and then Ben shoots the zombie, and he shows him, not getting affected by getting shot in the chest, so much so that they thought they could just use the exact same shot when he shoots him a second time, and then the zombie does the exact same thing. And then,
I guess they really want to hammer it home, that, these things are unkillable. Just in case you weren't sure, let's see it again.
I know, right? Essentially, but at the end, he's bowed down in the basement. He shoots Karen, and then also Mrs. Cooper comes back to life, real quickly. He shoots her, and then he shoots, Mr. Cooper as well, I think. And basically, he kind of just sits down there, and then we cut to, which is people that we were actually introduced earlier halfway into the movie on the TV. Basically, this hometown militia group of a bunch of people who were just going around and figuring out that shooting them in the head works. And basically they're just going around checking all the houses and just killing these things off one by one. And it seems to be pretty effective. Now, this is in the morning after the movie strikes. And basically, Ben had sat through the whole basement the whole time, and he finally came out because all the zombies had basically given up, gotten bored, and probably walked off or something. And so basically, he hears noise of these militia groups shooting the zombies outside. So he basically goes checked out, like from the upstairs room, and tries to look in there with his gun pointed just to see what's going on, to see if he's in danger. And we get the most, like, also memorable part of this movie, where the militia literally just hears a noise and sees the shadow of Ben in the house and says, "Yep, just get him right between the eyes." And then he gets shot in the head, and that's how Ben dies, ironically.
Yep, right amongst all the bodies.
Yeah, it's like the human hands were the real killers here.
It was the incompetent government that killed the populace. Not heavy-handed at all.
Well, I mean, again, for the time this movie came out, I think, like, the message was clear.
Well, yeah.
So, but basically, he gets his body dragged up in a segment basically for the credits where it's basically photographs at this point that look like newspaper article photographs of them carrying the bodies out and then burning them alive and stuff, and then just showing literally like a clip of fire burning at the end of the movie, and that's basically the end of the movie.
I mean, it's a good, story ender. Fire burns everything away clean.
Yep, and he's laid, ironically, Ben, the final person dead, is laid amongst the first dead person we see in the movie.
Yeah, like, essentially, and there's a lot of, like, basically topic of discussion that just comes around, him being killed by the humans' hands rather than just simply killed off by the zombies, both in terms of, like, kind of in a social political sense. It's brought up a lot of just points of discussion.
I mean, like, you can't make a piece of media without touching a little bit on political stuff, especially in horror. Like,
oh yeah,
the way the government handled the crisis, the murder crisis, was just like, it really showed how cold they were. They're just like, we'll not answer that at this time. We're working on it. Please don't bother us. It just really shows how disconnected they are from, like, these people who are, like, trying their best to hold out through the night.
Never mind this. We got it.
Yeah. Okay. But essentially, that's the end of the movie. And, yeah, I still think it's pretty much an iconic classic. You're never going to get wrong. It's still an enjoyable movie to watch. Yes, it's a bit dated in certain areas, but so is Dawn of the Dead and a bunch of other ones for some reason or another. But it's still a fun movie and enjoyable movie to watch. Now, I actually wanted to go over some interesting facts that I couldn't really, like, get a hold of to put in throughout the movie, but I basically wanted to talk about, after this movie was essentially shot, they literally put the film reel in the back of their truck, drove from Pittsburgh all the way to New York just to find a theater that would show it. They were looking for anything, essentially. And
yeah, it's like back in the day pitching. That's how you used to do it back then.
I mean, Pittsburgh didn't have anything really back then, so it only makes sense.
Yeah, actually, it was the first movie filmed in Pittsburgh, ironically.
I mean,
oh, really?
It's not like it was a pretty place to look at. They were filming in rural country, that's why.
But essentially, while they were driving, apparently it was the same night that Martin Luther King Jr. Was announced that he got assassinated.
Oh yeah, and they asked him. Yeah, they asked him, is there any special meaning that, like, you shot Ben right between the eyes just as this happened? And he's just like, we were on the truck. Like, there's no way we could have planned for that.
Well, like, in a lot of certain cases, it's all about timing,
It's bold that they kept it in there, especially after that, because they could have been like, oh man, this guy just got shot. We can't have our guy, who's also black, get shot right there. Like, like nowadays, like, I can remember specifically after, like, the 9/11 attacks, there were, like, some pieces of media that had, like, a lot of explosions put in them, and they had to be cut back because they're just like, oh man, that tragedy just happened. We can't have explosions so soon. I think it's rather nice that they left that scene in there, Like, they didn't make any changes. I don't know how it could have worked without that final bit of irony at the end.
I think it works to the movie's favor.
Yeah, it keeps it still relevant even after all this time to a degree. Basically, the other little tidbits I wanted to discuss was an interesting article. Apparently, when the movie was released, an issue of Reader's Digest actually in an article said that the movie shouldn't be watched because it would inspire cannibalism.
No one's going to try cannibalism who wasn't already going to try cannibalism because of that movie. Honestly, who would?
I mean, all that chocolate syrup, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I'd be down for it.
Yeah, so I just find that hilarious because any of these, like, controversial horror movies always has, like, a funny article you can find from the time that's trying to get people not to watch it for some ridiculous reason like that. Even now. But basically, there are other interesting things. We talked about alternate titles and, like, originally alternate, like, writing. Essentially, this movie was being made... like the whole writing of it and the script was kind of being made while it was just being made along with the movie. So originally there were different ideas how this movie was going to be. Apparently they didn't even get Night of the Living Dead, the title, until the end of the production of the movie. Essentially, there were a bunch of other titles called... for their first working title was actually Monster Flick. It was just simply called Monster Flick.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess they didn't want to make it sound like too cheesy right at the beginning.
Yeah, well, obviously Monster Flick probably wasn't going to be the final title anyways, but there were other interesting things that we go back to that Venus probe radiation segment, and it's actually quite interesting because they bring up how this movie was originally not going to be cannibals or zombies. It was actually going to be aliens that did all this stuff, and it was actually going to be called Night of the Flesh Eaters. So maybe there was more of that space element stuff that was going to happen in the movie originally.
I think that, the fact that they changed it definitely works to its favor. At the time in which this movie was being shot in the 60s, the campy B movie that's essentially a horror film was, nothing new to any audiences. In fact, it was a major, selling point for people that were adolescents or people that were preteens. And I think that the fact that they tried to flip up the script a little bit by, making that they were humans and they were caused by the radiation and kind of predisposing that works to the film's favor. If they had probably went with, making them just simply aliens, it wouldn't have separated them from the rest of the crowd.
But the other interesting thing is, originally it wasn't going to be zombies or aliens either. It was going to be mummies, and the movie was actually going to be called Night of Anubis.
Night of Anubis? That's just so terrible. Yeah, good thing they killed that idea.
Yeah.
There's probably a movie out there somewhere called Night of Anubis, and I'm offending some sort of like small fans. The no, The Mummy is called The Mummy. It's a different title. It's totally separate.
Yeah. But, I think that's about it in terms of this movie. Essentially, what we got as our end result is a movie that basically became the standard for almost all zombie movies.
Yeah, so many things from it just carry over still to today. I think it's still relevant, if not more, in our modern era where, we can kind of go back and look at a lot of the elements from it and, even take away some of the things that are a little bit more interesting, like the fact that it comes from Venus and a lot of, the ways that, like, zombies can think and rationalize. If you look at something like, 28 Days Later or something like that, where zombies are running and they're thinking and, they're more rational, that was considered, like, crazy revolutionary at the time, but it wasn't new.
Excuse me, Tiff, clearly those are infected human beings, not zombies.
Shut up.
I mean, it's different. It's different, like, oh man, those aren't zombies. These are just flesh eaters. They're totally different. This isn't an I Am Legend ripoff at all.
Technically, these aren't zombies either.
even though he did later admit that he did rip off that pretty bad. He's just like, well, shit, it's got to be something else. I can't use vampires. It's got to be something new. Let's use zombies.
Yeah, but before we go, I just want to basically make this little segment at the end something I do in general, which is basically if you want to watch this movie, where can I find it? Well, essentially, this is probably one of the easiest movies to track down on account it's public domain.
So it's on
Now,
YouTube, you know?
Yeah, it's on YouTube, but if you wanted a physical copy, you can probably find a Blu-ray, multiple Blu-rays of this movie, not any specific one. I mean, you can find this movie pretty much anywhere. Now, there are certain versions that you don't want to probably find. I know they made like not George Romero, but the other guy who worked on this, ironically, the guy who made Return of the Living Dead in 1985, the comedy, actually made a 30th anniversary of this movie that added additional scenes. The problem with they look like they were filmed clearly in the 90s, and all they did was put a black and white filter over it, so it looks very weird. Also, they changed the soundtrack, which you don't do.
Yeah, in addition, if I could bring it up, actually, if you go onto the Wikipedia page, because the film is public domain and it's, accessible due to the fact that George Romero made it public domain in order to receive the funding for the film, you can actually watch it on Wikipedia's page as well. That being said, though, we usually like to recommend DVDs or Blu-rays because you can not only get the content of the movie itself in a way that's easily accessible, you don't have to worry about an internet connection to be able to access it, but you also get bonus features, you get commentary.
Well, actually, ironically enough about that, in 2017, early 2017, back when George Romero was still alive, him and Quentin Tarantino, ironically, wanted to basically upgrade the movies like digital, like frame. Obviously, they wanted to make it like HD 4K type stuff for like a Blu-ray release, and they actually wanted to originally put back two scenes that for the longest time had actually been lost, and people thought that it was just lost to time because they were cut scenes. I don't know if you guys noticed this at any point, but during the part where the Coopers were arguing in the basement, there's a part where Mr. Cooper is looking one direction, and it has this weird cut where he then is looking at the other direction.
I noticed that.
Apparently there was a whole longer argument segment in that scene that they just cut because they thought it would be too, mean-spirited, I guess, for the time. There's also one shot of a bunch of the zombies out in the middle of the field walking amongst the field and stuff that apparently they thought had been lost, but apparently that footage had been found and they wanted to implement it back into the movie for the new release. I don't know with the death of George Romero changing the idea of this Blu-ray, but I would definitely be up for having that as part of my collection if they actually release that, because I can see anything with additional scenes put back into it as like a completed film version is probably the definitive version you should have.
Is it Night of the Living Dead Rebirth or Genesis?
I think that's like a sequel. I think that's just like a sequel that was made by a straight-to-DVD company. Essentially, because this was public domain, a lot of people wanted to use the name just to sell their own sequel that had nothing really to do with anything.
Night of the Living Dead 2 Electric Boogaloo. This time it's personal.
I mean, you're not wrong to some degree. They made a movie, I think, in the 90s, Night of the Living Dead 3D, which is awful. And you should not watch it at all.
Yeah, but the restored version of Night of the Living Dead, I actually just looked this up. It's coming to New York's Film Forum October 13th, this year, 2017. Yeah, so, if you actually want to go and see this, all these restorations with the extra scenes
go.
live, that would be the place to look into that.
Feel free to go and, enjoy, one of cinema's classics.
I mean, you can't go wrong with this. It's basically the perfect movie for any cheesy horror movie night. It still holds up pretty well. Well, I think that wraps it up for this episode. But basically, if any of you people listening want to actually hear more of us, we're actually going to be having podcasts throughout the week based on different subjects of pop culture. Tomorrow we'll be actually talking about collector items, and which we'll be talking about pop vinyl figures as our first episode on that.
By Funko.
Oh man.
Well, you see, Hope, we actually have other things. On Wednesday we'll be having an animation podcast where we're going to actually discuss what was it, Tiff? Prince Ahmed?
Yes, that's right. The Adventures of Prince Ahmed, which is actually in history the oldest surviving animated film. There's another one before that's considered lost. We're going to go over this one because you can actually get a DVD release of it. And since basically it's the oldest surviving one, we wanted to kind of introduce you guys more to the concept. You know, there's so many people that believe that Snow White is the first animated film. It is not. And to make things more interesting, basically we're going to go over some of its details and kind of introduce you to, you know, some of the facts about the film and the filmmaker herself, who is actually, on top of being the first, you know, animated film director that is, you know, surviving. This is also the first director that is on record that is female for an animated film.
Yep. So the next thing actually after that will be on Thursday will be our TV podcast, where we're actually going to go into the Twilight Zone.
All right, that's enough.
That'll be fun. And then Friday we'll have our general movie podcast. Basically, we'll talk about any kind of general movie that we decide to. And for this week, we're going to be talking about Monty Python and the Holy Grail to end things off on a blast.
So yeah, but basically we're going to go over it and kind of the facts and details and kind of share you our personal experiences of watching it. We watched it with a bunch of friends, and it was an absolute blast.
But that's not all, folks. Yes, there is more. Now, for everybody who's just watching our podcasts on any of the sites that you're watching this on, you get all these podcasts for free, basically, throughout each week. But if you want more from us, you can donate a couple of bucks to our Patreon, where we essentially are planning to do some other shows, such as our little show called Girls Night Out, where my two co-hosts here will basically...
Yeah, that's me.
That's us.
They're going to be watching usually movies that pander purposely or try to advertise to little girls of some degree, just trying to be so over the top to wanting to pander to women or girls that it seems almost ridiculous. We're talking about like those little Mary-Kate and Ashley videos. We're talking about Jim and the Holograms. We're talking about just like My Little Pony or like Barbie, little straight-to-DVD videos and stuff like that, which will be interesting.
Or women in general.
Yeah, because there's always times where they try to like go forward with it, and like sometimes it's successful, and then there's times where like people have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah, but also we want to do movie commentaries. Like, you want some free riff tracks for you? Well, you can get it from us if you want to hear more of our voices and our personal opinions while the movie's actually going.
Yes, more of our lovely, lovely voices.
Or if you just want to pay us money to stop talking, I mean, go ahead, throw some money in there if you don't want to hear more of us.
Either way, if you give us some money our way, then we'll be able to, you know, keep the lights on, produce more content, and just kind of keep the ball rolling. So that way, you know, we like doing this, so we'd like to be able to provide that for you.
Yep, I think that's it for our first horror podcast.
All
Thank
right.
you, girls, for joining me in this podcast.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
And see you guys later.
Alrighty,
Bye.
then. Well, I'll talk to you guys later.
Bye.
Alrighty. Goodbye.